Hey everyone, this is Randall and welcome back to the Imperial Minis channel. For this video we'll be taking a look at another Moonstone unit box, providing a review of the box and some tips and tricks for using this unit. The unit box we're focusing on in this video is Ribald the Troll, who belongs to the Dominion faction. Like I mentioned in my What is Moonstone video, Ribald is one of my absolute favorite units, both in terms of the model and the actual unit itself. Ribald has both the Troll and Goblin keywords, since he has a little goblin on his shoulders operating the cannon atop his head. Keywords in the game are extremely important since they enable synergies with unit abilities, allowing certain units to interact with the abilities of other units. After we review Ribald's abilities, we'll talk some more about the significance of his Troll and Goblin keywords. Taking a look at Ribald's stats, he has a below average melee stat of 2, a standard Troll melee range of 2 inches, an average arcane stat of 3 for his fire cannon ability, and a standard large model evade stat of +2. The most unfortunate stat that Ribald has is his melee stat of 2, which combines with the constraints of his Iron Knuckles passive ability to make him an unreliable melee unit. Considering he's a troll with a cannon on his head, it's easy to understand the unit design decision to make him a suboptimal melee unit. Ribald has 11 health, which is pretty standard for a troll, and he has 2 energy, which is also standard for trolls and giants. It's worth noting that Ribald's fire cannon arcane ability costs 2 energy, and Ribald's first energy pip will get removed after he's suffered 5 damage. So if Ribald takes a hit or 2, he may no longer be able to fire his cannon without support by heals or energy granting abilities by other characters in his troop. Ribald has the slow passive ability, which limits his jog actions to a 2-inch move instead of the usual 4-inch move. This means that it will take him longer to get into position to start firing his cannon, unless other characters in your troop can push him forward or give him energy to take additional step actions. One thing that slow does for you, though, is you don't really care about making Ribald a Moonstone carrier, since he starts off slow anyway. Carrying a Moonstone reduces your jog action to a 2-inch move, so this penalty won't affect Ribald. Ribald's Iron Knuckles passive ability gives him +2 to impact damage, which is great if you can draw an impact damage card with his melee stat of 2, unless he's the attacker and he draws +2 melee cards. He can't really reliably draw an impact card, meaning he's often going to be doing null damage, because other melee damage types are null. Ribald's Ramshackle Armorer passive ability reduces non-magical damage by 1, which is good, but since he's slow and has a high evade stat, he's going to be a very vulnerable target, so that damage will add up regardless. Now let's look at Ribald's Fire Cannon ability, which is the real reason you're bringing this big guy. Fire Cannon costs 2 energy and has an 8-inch range, which, while respectable, is not nearly as long as some rifle and bow characters with 12 inches and 10-inch ranges, respectively. Ribald will need to move up the field for a turn or 2 before firing his cannon, unless the enemy overextends early and offers a target of opportunity, or unless one of your own troop members can push him up. Fire Cannon does an impressive 3x -1 damage, which, depending on which card you draw or bluff you attempt, will do either 2, 5, or 8 impact damage. This is a wide range of damage, but it is impact damage, so it is susceptible to being mitigated by many forms of armor, be they ramshackle armor, plate armor, natural padding, or others. It especially feels bad shooting something with natural padding like Friar Flavius or the Jackalope or others, since it specifically mitigates impact damage. As such, hitting an enemy for 2 impact damage is unlikely to do much work for you. You really want to draw a 2 or a 3, so Ribald really wants to fire his cannon at enemies without good evade stats, or who are out in the open, unobscured, without any kind of cover. If Ribald suffers negative modifiers to his arcane stat, he's feeling really bad and a little bit useless. You can do things to mitigate this vulnerability, however, like pairing Ribald with Creep, who can prepare Ribald's target with his Victimize ability, increasing the enemy's evade stat by +2. Additionally, you can simply give Ribald more energy and take more shots. This can be achieved by having Creep use his Vitality draw on enemies and feeding that energy to Ribald, having the Duchess use Succubus to give energy to Ribald, or my personal favorite, having the Goblin King bonk Ribald on the head with his Rule the Roost ability, giving him 2 extra energy and letting Ribald activate again if he's already activated. The second part of Fire Cannon is a movement of X inches, where X is the value of the card you played. This move is situationally an asset or a liability. In some cases, you're really happy to blast that enemy character back a couple of inches. In other situations, you may have just pushed that character out of range of a second Ribald shot or arcane abilities by your other characters. I've had this move come in really clutch before, where I was able to push an enemy character just out of range to be able to grab a Moonstone at the very end of the game, which allowed me to keep my lead in the game and win. Here's a gameplay example of that taking place in a previous game I played. So in this picture here you see Ribald engaged with Brunhilde here, and over up on the top of the screen you see the enemy Gotchgut bearing down on Creep. Now I believe, if memory serves, at this point of the game Creep had a Moonstone, and I really wanted to get him back to kind of my deployment zone, get him out of there as quickly as possible. Now Gotchgut intercepted him and put a beat down on him, killed Creep, and I think he killed him within 2 inches of himself, so the Creep couldn't do anything back. So the Moonstone got dropped about an inch away from Gotchgut. Now my last activation of Ribald in turn 4 of the game, I fired at Gotchgut, which, I had no chance of really killing him, but in firing at him I was able to push Gotchgut a couple of inches away, which put him like 1 inch away from being able to collect that Moonstone and secure the game. So I think this game ended up being a tie, if I remember correctly. But Ribald being able to send a cannonball downrange to push Gotchgut just a little bit out of the way was able to keep me from losing at least. You may, depending on the situation, actually use Fire Cannon specifically for its long-range movement effect. Pushing back an enemy character, perhaps from getting a Moonstone, before one of your characters can get there, or throwing a cannonball into a melee, chucking the enemy character out of the melee so your character can hopefully get away or harvest a nearby Moonstone. The last component of Ribald's Fire Cannon ability that we should talk about is its Catastrophe Effect. If your bluff gets called and your opponent slaps down a Catastrophe, Ribald's cannon will explode, dealing him 3 wounds and dealing all characters within 2 inches of him 3 magical damage and pushing them back 1 inch. This Catastrophe sounds bad, and it sure can be. If you're surrounded by friendly units when it pops off, it's going to feel pretty bad to have multiple friendly units suffer 3 magical damage and get shoved. If this happens in the midst of a bunch of enemies, however, this detonation can be glorious. If you march Ribald right into a bunch of enemies, or if he gets surrounded by multiple enemies, you could potentially trigger this catastrophe yourself. You could attempt to use the Fire Cannon Arcane ability and hope to draw a Catastrophe card from the Arcane deck and then declare that as your card when you use the ability. Alternatively, you could also bring the Revenant in your list, who's a good pick regardless of Ribald Synergy. With the Revenant, you can use his Visions of the Future ability to remotely detonate Ribald during Revenant's activation, using him like a troll, goblin, suicide bomber. Ideally, Ribald will happily shoot cannonballs at his foes and not need to be used like a walking explosive device, but this self-destruct button is a consideration worth keeping in mind. Finally, moving on to Ribald's signature move, players have another bite at the self-destruction apple. Ribald can convert a High Guard into what amounts to his Fire Cannon's Catastrophe Effect. As previously discussed, Ribald only has a melee stat of 2, so even if you're the attacker, you'll be drawing a maximum of 4 cards unless you've buffed his melee stat with another ability or by spending an extra energy to go for it. In the right situation, though, it might be worth detonating Ribald, dealing himself 3 wounds but causing 3 magical damage to multiple enemies, especially if that could potentially kill off a character or 2, or push them far enough away from a Moonstone to allow Ribald or an ally to pick it up. I think that with the upcoming release of the Shades of Moonreach faction, Ribald's Area of Effect Detonation, Catastrophe Effect, and Signature move might have a little bit more utility. The Shades have multiple characters that summon small 1 to 2 health psychopomps that provide a variety of abilities, but can, if nothing else, clutter up their opponent's melees, inflicting distraction debuffs to opponents' melees and potentially screening them from picking up Moonstones. AoE abilities such as Ribald's Fire Cannon Catastrophe Effect and the Short Fuse Signature move are perfect for sweeping away swaths of psychopomps in one fell swoop, taking away a key component of the Shades players' strategy and forcing them to expend time and resources to replace those psychopomps. Time will tell, though, whether the Shades players routinely play multitudes of psychopomps or just a couple here and there. Alright, now we're going to look at some keyword synergies here with Ribald. So first off, Ribald is a troll, obviously. So for some troll synergy, you could bring along Null the troll, and what he has is the Trollish Remedies ability. So for 3 energy, he can give another troll in his troop the Tough as Old Boots ability. This is a passive ability that character will have for the rest of the game. And at the start of the replenish step, that model would recover 2 wounds for the rest of the game. So This will give Ribald a reliable self-heal every single turn of the game, which could help mitigate some of the Goblin King bonk damage that if you're bringing the Goblin King and you're bonking Ribald every turn, this would kind of negate the two wounds from that. This would also just help heal him up from getting beat up by other players, and this could also help mitigate Ribald's kind of self-destructive catastrophe or signature move if you wanted to use them like that. Alright, so now we're going to move on to the Goblin Synergies, and it's worth noting that Ribald is the only troll in the game who also has a Goblin keyword, and in the Dominion faction, having the Goblin keyword really opens up a ton of different synergies, so it really makes Ribald one of the most synergy-strong trolls, I would say, in the entire game, if not the strongest in terms of keyword synergy. So looking at Portly Pete here, he has the Goblin City Guard passive ability. So if Ribald is carrying a Moonstone, which you may want him to, like I mentioned before, the slow keyword doesn't really affect him as a Moonstone carrier. He's got a lot of health. He's generally going to be wanting to stand back a little ways, so he may very well be a Moonstone carrier. With the Goblin City Guard keyword, or passive effect, excuse me, for Portly Pete, Portly Pete can just body block a damaging attack on Ribald. So it reads, if a goblin in possession of a Moonstone within 4 inches and line of sight suffers damage, you may have this character suffer all that damage instead. And it's worth noting here also that this would also soak up his catastrophe damage. So if Ribald detonates himself and Portly Pete is 4 inches away, Portly Pete could be the one to absorb those 3 magical damage instead of Ribald. And then a little less useful, but also worth noting because there is some synergy here, is Portly Pete's Stand to Attention active ability. This would really just give Ribald 1 energy, which 1 energy isn't enough to fire his cannon, but it could allow him to step forward to fire it again. And the second part of the Stand to Attention ability doesn't apply to Ribald because he's not a soldier. But yep, that's it for Portly Pete. Now moving on to C6 Stew. He has an active ability, Body Jokes, which is a 4-inch pulse, and all goblins within the pulse are moved 1 inch directly toward this model, C6 Stew, and then all other goblins within 1 inch gain +1 energy. So if you keep C6 Stew near Ribald, you could pop this and give Ribald an extra energy. It's not the biggest, strongest synergy out there, but if you are leaning into kind of that kind of goblin pirate list, Ribald is definitely a good choice because he does have, you know, a big cannon on top of his head. So if you're going for, you know, kind of the fluff pirate build, C6 Stew is a pirate, Ribald is a guy with a big cannon on top of his head. It kind of works. All right, now moving on to Shabon, who is the ultimate Dominion Goblin Mad Lad. He has 3 different abilities that could potentially benefit Ribald. So he has his Goblin Mischief ability, which is the 6-inch pulse. You essentially just flip an arcane card to each of the goblins within the pulse, and then based on what you draw, they could potentially get 1 energy, 2 energy, 3 energies, or suffer wounds, or have nothing happen to them. So, you know, with this one, Ribald could potentially get 3 energy or get a couple of extra energy to get a free fire cannon shot. And then moving down to Goblin Luck, this requires drawing a 3, has an 8-inch range, and this is another way for Ribald to trigger his Catastrophe Effect. So this will let Shabon detonate Ribald remotely within 8 inches if he's able to draw any one of the 3s, which I think Shabon has the highest arcane stat of any character in the game, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but if it's not the highest, it is probably tied for the highest or near the highest at a 7, so he's going to be drawing a lot of cards, so the chances of him getting one of those 3s is actually pretty decent. And then finally, Shabon has his Transcombobulate ability, and if he's able to draw a blue or pink 3, he restores all the wounds and all the energy of a target goblin, and then he can kind of teleport it within 8 inches of himself. So with this, you could potentially use Ribald to fire his cannon 3 times in a turn. So you could have Ribald activate, fire his cannon, do whatever he's going to do, and then have Shabon transcombobulate him to give him his energy back, and then have the Goblin King bonk Ribald on the head, and then have Ribald activate again, and then have now enough energy to fire his cannon 2 more times. So I know there's a lot of dependencies there to make that happen, but it's a pretty cool thought. All right, and then finally, the man, the myth, the legend, the Goblin King. So he has a few different abilities here that can affect Ribald. He has Royal Privileges passive. Whenever this character would suffer damage, you may have a friendly goblin within 4 inches and line of sight suffer all that damage instead. So this is really just beneficial to the Goblin King, as almost everything is on his card. But you can allow Ribald to soak some wounds for the Goblin King. And then skipping past Rule the Roost for now, his Gimme ability, his Gimme active ability, will allow the Goblin King to take a Moonstone from Ribald. So if Ribald's carrying a Moonstone, the Goblin King can take it off of him. It's not going to cause Ribald to move any faster, but it may take a little bit of the heat off of Ribald if your opponents are kind of focusing in on him. But I will say that when Ribald is on the table, he is a bit of a distraction card effects in and of himself without even being a Moonstone carrier, because of the kind of the high top end damage he can do with that fire cannon ability. So I always find, no matter what, unless he's very safely kind of behind the front line, the enemy is generally going to try to target him with some kind of attack or arcane ability. And then the Rule the Roost ability. I've talked about this before, but the Goblin King swings his almighty scepter of power over his head, hits Ribald right in the noggin, and then Ribald suddenly gets a second burst of energy and can activate again and fire his cannon again if he wants to. And then I just want to reiterate how useful Creep and the Duchess are for Ribald. Between the two of them, they can give him additional energy. With Creep's Vitality Draw ability, the Duchess's Succubus ability, which could also end up healing Ribald some. I will also say that Creep's Victimize ability, like I mentioned before, is extremely useful, especially when you're fighting a troop that has a very low evade stat. Like if, let's say, Ribald goes up against a fairy list and all the fairies are -2 evade, that means if Ribald's shooting his cannon at them, he's essentially always going to be just drawing 1 arcane card. So drawing 1 arcane card does not feel good, especially when you're really hoping to fish for a 2 or a 3. So victimizing your enemies before shooting that cannon can really help to mitigate their evade, mitigate cover, or if they're just standing out in the open and don't have a good evade stat, to really allow you to have a better chance of fishing for that perfect green card you're looking for. Now, before we wrap up, let's take a look at the verdict on Ribald and see how he stacks up against our various review criteria. So, looking at damage dealing, although the damage he puts out is kind of swingy, I am going to give him a 5. I'm going to give him a 5 out of 5 here, just for that top end dream green 3 you can pull that can really just delete enemy models. So, you might say this should be more like a 3 or a 4, because you could all game only draw green 1s and just do little plink damage. But speaking from personal experience, generally whenever I bring Ribald in a game, I get at least a couple of really good shots off with him, and those shots can sometimes be game changing. So for me, damage dealing is going to be a 5 out of 5. Healing and energy manipulation, easily 0 out of 5. He doesn't heal. He doesn't have any real energy shenanigans. Out of action movement, I'm going to give a 1 out of 5. This could be a 2 out of 5, but I'm not going to factor in his catastrophe movement. His catastrophe self-destruction, pushing people back, just because it's not something you can really rely on too much to happen, and it really has to. All the pieces kind of have to be in place in the right way for that to really pop off and be useful. But I will give 1 out of 5 stars just because his fire cannon ability does push people back. I'm not giving him more than 1 star because that is a little bit of a double-edged sword, like I mentioned. You know, it can push somebody away from a Moonstone or push somebody back from your characters, but it can just as easily push somebody out of range of some of your abilities. So I'm going to give it a 1 out of 5 stars. For utility abilities, I'm going to give him a 2 out of 5. So this is where the Ramshackle Armor comes in. You know, it's good, but not great. His Iron Knuckles comes in, which Iron Knuckles is, I mean, it's good when you draw an impact card, but if you draw anything other than an impact card, it's just horrible. So the 2 out of 5 here is going to be just from Ramshackle Armor, and then those kind of dream scenarios where you use Ribald as a walking explosive device, which are pretty unpredictable and unreliable, but when you're able to successfully pop that off, and it's popped off at the right time and at the right place, it's absolutely glorious. So I have to give him 1 star for that. And then for keyword synergy, this is going to be a 5 out of 5 for me. So like I said, having the Goblin keyword just unlocks so many synergies in the Dominion faction, and for being such a big chunky model with a huge cannon on his head, having so many different keyword synergies within the Dominion faction is just awesome. So, you know, anytime you've got any kind of a Goblin list, Ribald is usually going to have a pretty good time in that list. And then for value is one of these kind of subjective categories a little bit for me. I find I use Ribald all the time when I run Goblin lists. He just always seems to have a good place, even if he's just a big chunk of meat that goes in and grabs Moonstones or grabs your backline Moonstones and flings a few shots throughout the game. I always find he's useful for something. I mean, and like I mentioned before, he is a big distraction card effect, so he will, if nothing else, draw attention to himself, and you know, the enemy player will try to soak some resources into him. And then for overall rating, like I said in the last video, this isn't scientific. I'm not doing an average. This is just my own kind of roll-up of these abilities, kind of internally weighing the value of these different criteria. So for me, I'm going to give him a 4 out of 5 because really you're bringing him for that alpha damage. You're bringing him for all the keywords, the keyword synergy within the Dominion Goblin list. And just for being a big troll with a lot of health that can just potentially do some awesome damage and pull off some really cool moves. So for me, he's a 4 out of 5 character. He's not going to fit into every Dominion list, but if you're bringing goblins, a lot of times you're going to want to bring Ribald because he's just so cool. The model's cool. The abilities are cool. Every time I bring him, I've had a good time with him. I have yet to have a bad game with Ribald. I've had some that are better than others, but I am never sorry that I brought Ribald. So overall, I'm going to give him a 4 out of 5. Well, I think that just about does it for this unit box review of Ribald. There is certainly more that could be discussed in terms of synergies, strategies, etc., but I've droned on long enough now to give you an idea of why I like this guy so much. I have more videos like this planned, so if you've enjoyed this series so far, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. I'll probably focus first on the troop and unit boxes that I own and have played, since I'll have the most informed opinions about them. I'll then branch out into other boxes, doing a bit more educated guesswork and theory crafting. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to toss it a like. If you really enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel. If there is anything you feel that I missed, or if you have your own experiences with Ribald on either side of the table that you'd like to share, please drop that in a comment. Till next time, this is Randall, signing off.